Secondly, it's not an epistemological statement. It's not a statement that being determines consciousness. It's a statement about the sociology of knowledge, about the processes by which social ideas are formed, coming from the observation of process over time. And being concerned with the historical sociology of knowledge, it seems to me to be about the way in which certain ideas, from the pool of ideas, certain ideas are selected, endorsed by institutions, formulated in modern societies in educational forms, to give rise to a legitimating ideology, which is something quite distinct from those ideas, conforming to the interests of particular groups. And I think no example of the formation of ideology is more relevant than Soviet and orthodox Marxist ideology itself, which is clearly a ideological formation derived from a pool of Marxist ideas. And the two things are quite distinct. Yes, ideology gives rise to, from ideology we can study certain characteristic illusions or deep structures, and I agree, and I think this is an advance of modern Marxist thought, the consciousness of the way in which it can give rise to certain categories which reach right down to the level of consciousness itself. But these seem to me to be already always in friction with another category, experience. And indeed, it is experience, particularly, which I think is central to our problem now. It's a category which requires a great deal more examination, and one which is crucial, I think, to the whole problem of social change. Okay, I mean, we all know experience is not innocent. We all know there are impurities in experience. But equally, historians, and I think anthropologists, know that experience is not illusory. That is, certain philosophic accounts of experience, which concentrate upon the impurity, epistemological impurity of experience, are simply at odds with the material which historians handle every day of their working lives. That is, experience breaks into the historian's study without any knocking in the form of demographic crises, technological change, sexual technology, the birth control pill, crises of subsistence, wars, and the kind of succession of consequences which Keith Hopkins has just given us. This is the kind of way in which experience breaks through. And I think in the particular tradition I was referring to, our work in popular culture is rather relevant if we're concerning change. Am I going on too long?
If you could move towards the
conclusion
now.
Well, I would have now then to reinsert.
Let him go on. I would gladly give up my time this afternoon. I want to say half. I mean, my words would be repeating what Keith would say. Let him go on.
Well, Godelli said, and I think probably really we are saying very similar things. He said that the concept of ideology has to be placed alongside an elaborated concept of power. And I would say that, I would simply rephrase this in terms of the concept of ideology arises within the context of a concept of contradiction, which is in societies which I have observed mediated by class, and this contradiction can be seen in two ways. First, as a contradiction of interest, but also as a contradiction of differential experience. Again, a category I haven't fully examined. And in terms of differential experience, this can be seen in one sense in terms of a contradiction in ideas. And we have to remember that in medieval and early modern society, much of the practice of that society was a mystery of apprenticeship, which was transmitted by the workers, the skilled workers themselves. And the ruling class could not conceivably have carried on the practice of its own society. And one can't talk about that practice as ideology. And secondly, in the sense that there are alternative norms in any society. And much of our work has been concerned with the culture-forming process, the way in which, from below, foresters or handloom weavers or particular kinds of working community form their own necessary normative, their own value system, which is partly defensive and partly protective. which does not give rise to dispensing with the notion of an overarching, dominant hegemony within which, well, this whole question is another question, and one I would love to talk about, but I think I'd better not. But we return then to this question of social being determines social consciousness. Within social being, we have then to define the involuntary, compulsive, and received, including ideation and norms, components of material life. Social consciousness is how men handle this received experience in cultural ways. So that our critical problems are those of determination, and those of change require not so much a theory of power as a specific examination of contradiction inherent in specific modes of production, the kind of thing Keith Hopkins was doing, kind of dialogue which went on about the transition from feudalism to capitalism, which Rodney Hilton and others were engaged in, have been engaged in over the years. Could I perhaps just jump to a final comment, which is about this question of the question which I think that Godele very importantly placed before us, this question of the reciprocity of relations in a system of domination. Now, this is a thing which I have been for some time studying, particularly in relation to 18th century society. In one sense, you can see this in a dichotomy, in a friction between law on the one hand and custom on the other hand. Domination is never absolute. But given a certain equilibrium of classes, one can see, and this was a very long equilibrium in British society from late 17th to the early 19th century, you can see, in fact, a society functioning with stability, reproducing itself, not without conflict, but with particular modes and institutional devices and means of handling and resolving conflict. And within this, one finds many local resistances, one finds particular modes of work, particular kinds of community, engendering and nourishing alternative modes, and one finds the possibility of kinds of revolt and alternative ideas developing. This overarching domination is, if you like, the common sense of a society, given the ruling relations of that society, which is accepted as part of the daily experience of people as how to get through their life with the minimum of trouble. They can't get through life without it. But implicit in the notion of reciprocity, in any society I've studied, is that to maintain their legitimation, the rulers must not only seem to, but be actually seen to perform certain functions. And they are to that degree, I think, actually prisoners of the rule. Not absolute prisoners, but in the sense that unless they perform those functions, their legitimacy will be challenged. And in the 18th century, one sees this continually, particularly in a crucial relation in the bargaining over prices, the food riot. This is true also of France, in which the legitimacy of the rulers depends upon their handling this very critical moment in social experience, shortage of food, danger of a subsistence crisis, and their manifest ways of appearing to intervene and of actually intervening with the sanction of riot imposed from below. So that here you have an equilibrium in which both parties are, in fact, in a kind of reciprocal relation, although one is dominating and one is dominated. So that when we are concerned with the question of social change, one, I think, must have a concept of contradiction. One must have, I think, a concept of the epochal conditions, the logic of process of a given mode of production, and the limits beyond which that can't be transcended. And into that, one has to reinsert this lost question in this debate, this question of agency. This question of agency, and I'm afraid that Marx was if we're to denounce humanism, Marx was to be severely denounced for the humanism of his historical consciousness. His insistence upon human agency is ever present there. And we have then to examine once more the whole notion and the actual term, determination. Are we meaning, when we say determination within a given mode of production, that there are certain limits which cannot be transcended within that mode of production, that there are certain possibilities which may be immense within that mode of production, but beyond that there are other possibilities which are absolutely rejected, that a logical process is involuntary within that logical process, but within that logical process many alternatives may be possible? Is that what we're saying? Or by determined, are we saying something much more deterministic? Now, I tend to take the first position, although I think what Brodel describes as material life in its determining force is more absolute than the mode of production. That is, I think there are geological, demographic determinations which are more absolute than the determinations of a mode of production, whose determinations are those of logic of process and epochal limits which can't be transcended. Agency exists within those determinations, and then if you were to ask how you transcend those determinations, you have to turn to the essential notion of contradiction and where that contradiction reaches a point that equilibrium can no longer be reconciled within that society. I'm sorry to go on so long.
Thank you.